Welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. It's really honor and pleasure. I'm here with Michel Bauwens, and we don't have a long history of knowing each other, but I've actually been familiar with the P2P Foundation, the founder of P2P Foundation, and a real innovator in the peer-to-peer space, an internet leader, an activist, a philosopher, author, and somebody who I think has a brilliant vision for what the wisdom commons might be. So I look forward to really getting to hear your story. Welcome, Michel, to the program.
Yeah, happy to talk to you, Gregg. It's very early here, but I hope my brain will kick in anyways.
Right. Well, it's late here, so I might teeter out like the end of the conversation,
Right.
but we'll see what happens. We are on the opposite sides of the planet, but thankfully to Zoom, we're able to connect. You're in Thai, is that right? Thailand?
Yes, I'm in Thailand, in the north of the country. It's called the city called Chiang Mai.
Wow.
Which is kind of a capital of digital nomads.
Really?
So before COVID, we had 25,000 people on a Facebook group called Chiang Mai Digital Nomads.
Wow.
So lots of people are here working remotely. You know, like the Mozilla Foundation used to have a dozen people here.
Wow.
And you know, they earn pretty good money as developers in California, but then by living here, they spend only a quarter of what they would spend there. And so that, you know, that kind of arbitrage attracts people. It's a very nice town, I must say. It's
fascinating. How long have you been there? How long have you been there?
I've been here for a long time. I moved in 2003.
Okay.
But then I launched the P2P Foundation formally around 2007, and then I just started having more and more invitations for talks.
Right. Okay.
So I ended up doing from 5 to 7 months of touring.
Wow.
But then that suddenly stopped in March 2020.
Yeah. As lots of things did, huh?
Yeah. So I've been home, and you know, I switched to a study regime while I'm here.
Okay.
I'm pretty mobilized for doing like a reading sabbatical.
Gotcha. Well, I think folks who listen to this would be really just interested in hearing your story a bit, kind of like how you got pulled into this, and then ultimately sort of leading up to sharing your peer-to-peer vision and what the foundation is. And then once we get into that space, we'll start talking wisdom commons and UTOK and wherever else it takes us in terms of our shared interest and overlapping perspectives. So how about we start with that?
Yeah, so I'm gonna maybe summarize, you know, what led up to the creation of P2P Foundation and a switch in my life.
Okay.
By two threads, and one is the professional one, and one is the more like, you know, life experience.
Gotcha.
So let me start with the professional one, which I'll keep short. Is I started as a librarian, and something called reference librarian in the US tradition, which is a kind of librarian that is at your service. You know, like you go to the library and they're there to really help you.
Right.
But I was working for the United States Information Agency, which is a branch of the US State Department, and used to have like a global network of what they called American libraries. And it's better than you would think, because, you know, you could think it's just propaganda, but they had a remit to represent the wide variety of American culture as well. So we had everything from the Nation, the New Republic, progressive in these times, all the way up to the Heritage Foundation and Brookings Institute.
Okay.
So and it was a great job. And so from that moment on, I became really a curator, which is, you know, selecting material for other people.
Right.
So there was about US social and political processes. And I started my career following Biden way back, you know, in the first election in the 80s. I can't remember what year that was, but anyway, then I worked for British Petroleum, where I was a strategic business information manager. And that involved really working for the top layer of the agro business section of BP. And that was amazing training, because, you know, an executive would come and would ask me, can you prove to me that X is Y?
Okay.
And then another one would come and ask me, well, can you prove to me that X is not Y?
Ah, huh, yeah.
So that multi-perspectival work of that was really interesting, and that
Yes.
stayed with me. So then I launched a magazine, Wave, which was like a synthesis of the Wired and Mondo 2000. I don't know if you're
Right.
familiar with Mondo 2000. Was a
Wired, yes. Mondo 2000, not as much.
it was a way out, California counterculture thing.
Okay.
Early transhumanism.
Ah,
and all
okay,
that
gotcha.
stuff.
Yep.
And so anyway, so we launched that. It lasted a year and a half. Then I did 2 internet startups. One on intranets and extranets, and one on what we call tribal marketing.
Yeah, interesting.
And that involved, like a craft vision of communication between our clients and virtual communities. So we would actually negotiate very specifically with moderators and curators and say, okay, what is acceptable to you as a way to and so that worked until 2001.
Okay.
When there was the first internet crash. I don't know if you remember.
The .com bubble, you mean?
Exactly. Yeah, I was in the middle of it, and we lost like 90% of our clients in a heartbeat. And so that brings me to a job at US Web CKS, which was a very fast-growing web consultancy under the leadership of Joe Firmage, which I don't know if you know this and if you're familiar with Ken Wilber.
I'm familiar with
Joe
Ken Wilber.
Firmage is the man who funded the Integral Institute.
Really? Okay. No, I did not know that. That's fascinating.
Yeah. And he's also a man who believes in reverse engineering of alien technology. I never got into it, but anyway, that was one of his things, and he was rich enough to be able to do this.
Fund that, explore those things. Yep.
Yeah. And then my very last job was strategic director, or rather strategic knowledge director for the largest telecommunications company in Belgium. Okay, so that's the formal part. Maybe not so interesting, but
well, no, it's good to get the landscape and the time, and you get pulled into the internet world and the various facets of that. That's good to know.
Right. So then the other side is, so I started from a working class family. My mother was barely literate. What they call functional illiteracy. And both my parents worked until they were 13, and then when I was a child, I grew up in very poor circumstances. We had leaking roof, and I got asthmatic bronchitis when I was like 18 months old. Got taken away from my parents, and had to go in these sanatoriums. And I remember, what kind of traumatic things, like having to eat my vomit and being in a glass cage and having these very long nails that nobody was cutting.
Yeah, that's pretty intense.
And so why do I tell you this? Because it's formative, right? Of
course. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I tend to that kind of thing.
Yeah. And so what happened was that I started my life with quite a traumatic mindset, and that turned me very early. I'm talking like really 10 years old into an activist modality. I was outraged by the injustice in the world and why people were suffering, including myself. And so that lasted a number of years. So kind of I was a Trotskyist at that time. And after 7 years of this, I realized that I was going straight into a wall because my personal issues were not attended to. And, you're kind of in a way outside of yourself. And at some point I said, well, this is not working.
Okay.
And if I cannot change the world outside, then I have to change it inside, right?
A lot of
And
people
then I
come to that
went-
conclusion.
Right. And then I found the Gregg type way back. But it was interesting. So I'll just go briefly over it. So I started with Wilhelm Reich, a Freudo-Marxist theory of the repression of the libido, and that but you work through the body, and it's called character analysis, and you look at the structure of the body and how you have like a muscular harness that keeps you from being in the flow of life. Live in a commune, they had organ boxes and everything, and all of that. Also the free relationships, and so that was really interesting as an experience, when you're a young man.
Sure.
And then I went to basically all the California stuff. I did rebirthing and primal scream and postural integration, all of that. And that at some point, then I started thinking, oh, there's more, there's more than just like your psyche, there's something. So I went on a fairly intensive spiritual search, which, I started with Eastern stuff. Tibetan meditation, Sufi workshops, all kinds of these things. And I was never a sannyasin, but I was pretty close to an Osho community. So I also lived in a commune of that nature. I went to Rajneeshpuram, in Oregon, and I don't know if you've seen the movie Wild Wild Country, which is amazing. And I was there,
Wow. Okay.
I didn't see me in the picture, but I was there for a while.
Wow.
But and at the same time, this was also everything went wrong there. And so that brought me really into thinking about spiritual authoritarianism and power and conformity and I had this Tai Chi teacher, and she said Tai Chi is fantastic, and then suddenly Osho said, no, it's a martial art, it's bad, and then suddenly it was bad. So how people could switch,
right,
not on their own accord, but just by following somebody else. That was something I experienced there.
Fascinating.
And at some point I said, okay, I've done enough Eastern stuff, and I went into the Western esoteric stuff.
The Western esoteric, did you say? Esoteric?
Yeah.
Okay,
so,
gotcha.
I've been a Mason, I've been a Rosicrucian, a Templar. I did a year of
I'm
alchemy.
checking a lot of boxes here, Michael. I don't know.
Yeah. And you have to, I wasn't not a tourist. I was really very earnestly looking for, the answer. Right.
Wow.
And okay, I'm going to tell you this because it was very also formative for me. So at some point I met a neo-Gnostic, neo-Cathar, the Cathar religion in
I'm following.
in France in the 11th century. And I encountered this kind of Gnostic point of view where, you have this idea that this world is totally lost, right? So the only way out is to go to the other one, the perfect, still. But here you're in the yin yang, and if you make an effort to make something better, it will get worse somewhere else. Because this is there's no salvation in this world. And paradoxically, that created the opposite reaction. I suddenly kind of understood what the fundamental choices that Western civilization had made. Which was about incarnation and solidarity with everybody. and being a Christian, meaning you have to make the world a better place, right? And so, in a very strange way, that pushed me back into the mainstream. And also because of all my experiences, I had done so much work on myself that, I cannot pinpoint a magical moment, but I was different. I had my act together. I felt, like everybody else at some point, And so then I decided, now I have to do something with my life. I have enough tools. Stop doing all that stuff. Right. And so I went into business.
Okay.
Right. And that then connects with my other life I explained before. Maybe one more thing I should say, in the late 90s, I did a documentary called Technocalypse about the metaphysics of religion and the end of man. And that was an in-depth 3-hour investigation of the unconscious religious motivations of transhumanism.
Okay.
Right. I had this thesis that I still have, and now I have a lot more that I know about it. But this idea that transcendence is baked in us, like we need this, and that when we secularized, that didn't disappear, but it became unconscious and translates itself in these utopian dreams about what technology can do for us, right? And so the story is that it's not just a capitalist thing, making money. It's really a gnostic project.
Okay.
And so there's even a professor, I think his name is Richard Thompson, who has this whole book and where he shows you have the 64 sadhanas of yoga, and how each of them is now represented by a technology. Like bilocation and then of course at the end of the dream, and this is where transhumanism is interesting, is so you have the scientists and they each have their own dream, right? And transhumanism takes all these dreams together and then believes that it's all there already. Right. And then builds a vision of humanity which ends up in a space which is really like omniscience, omnipresence, which is a material manifestation of our ideas about the divine, right? But because it's unconscious,
right,
it makes it very dangerous.
Definitely.
Because they don't know what they're doing, right?
Right.
And it doesn't have all these checks and balances that an institutional religion would have. And we can talk about this later, but I believe that after the breakdown of our belief in spirituality in the West, that nearly every political movement is actually a gnostic attempt, right? Where
to channel that.
Yeah, what you're doing is basically you no longer believe it can be done in this other way. So what you do is you want to experience and do this in the material world, right? And I don't know if you're interested in this, but I'm reading Eric Voegelin. He's a very interesting author, and he has a book, The End of Modernity.
I'm not familiar with it, but I've been really interested.
So I'll give you the
please.
brief story. I'll give you the brief story. So, in a pagan polytheistic environment, everything is sacred, and especially power. So the emperor is divine, and the politicians are also the leaders of the civic cults, who lead the sacrifices, and so you sacrifice, and that makes you strong as a community, and you can win the wars and go conquer. But Christianity does the opposite. It empties out the sphere of the sacred. It empties out the world of the sacred, and it creates a double world where you have a temporal world which is not sacred, and then the church takes care of the transcendence part, right?
Yep.
And that is what Gnostics then don't accept. Is so starting in the 12th century, you get the movements, and there was a mystic called Joachim de Fiore. And so Augustine was still a dualist. You have this world and the other world, and you have the world of the Old Testament and the world of the New Testament, then it ends. There's no future. But once you have this idea of the three ages, that's the moment the West start thinking that we can have progress in our society, right? And then you want to transfigure humanity in this world, right? And that's basically what ideology has done. Marxism, Stalinism, you know, Nazism, and maybe we can talk about this also at the end, wokeism.
Yes,
You know, these are all gnostic movements.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of the story. So I ended up more or less having my act together, you know, like psychologically and spiritually.
Gotcha.
Engaged in the business world as a creative pursuit, you know, by being an entrepreneur and but my last job, I was starting to feel not okay again, in the sense that, so I had abandoned my engagement of my youth.
Okay.
Right. The utopian ideas of changing the world. But in some way it was done emotionally through a rejection. And therefore I felt this kind of emptiness of having abandoned my dreams.
Right. Yeah,
Right.
And that gets you in the heart. Yep.
Yeah. And just carrying on with things and having a certain pleasure, but fundamentally feeling I was like, you know, not on the right track somehow. And the more I was, you know, going up in business, the more I saw the corruption and the, you know, the cheating with the accounting systems and all that, you know, like the fictitious value system that we have. And, you know, I could tell you anecdotes about that were like,
I bet you
wow,
could.
you know, like, how does that work? Wow, you know, this is like, this is where like a piece of theater that we're in. And so anyway, so basically what happened was I had a huge burnout.
Okay.
And you know, my theory of a burnout is that you don't have burnout because you work hard. You have burnout because you work hard and your spirit is not in it.
Right. Yes.
That's why you have a burnout, right? So you're increasingly at odds with what you're doing, and that drains your energy and at some point, like, you know, it just
the heart pulls the plug on it.
exactly. And so then I entered a really deep crisis. This was like 96, 97.
Okay.
And I had a year where everything went wrong. My father died. My mother got Alzheimer. I had a company. You know, there was a conflict around accounting stuff. I had made this movie, but it didn't go out as planned because there was a conflict between the director and the producer. And I had a big fight with Ken Wilber. You know, I was a devotee of Ken Wilber. I have his collected works here in my library, you know, 8 volumes. And I had a relationship issue, everything at the same time. And so I went completely, you know, at the bottom. And that's when I felt like what William James describes, you know, where he says there's 2 kinds of people. The ones born, and you know, they're lucky enough to have great parents, live in a, you know, in a place that's friendly to their development, and they fit in the world, right? And then you have others, and they're born and they say something is wrong here. You know,
it's a misfit.
This cannot possibly be the way it's supposed to be, right? And so you're at odds, right? And those people will have a crisis at some point if they're lucky. And it's only then that they transform themselves and become what he calls twice born people, right? And while it's a very hard path, at the same time, once you've done it, because of your suffering, you get this richness that people who fit in immediately won't have. Right? Because
no, there's a whole depth.
Anyway, yeah, I feel that this is what happened to me. And then
Okay.
you have this notion of central version from Eric von Neumann. He's a Jungian.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, you know, the first part of your life, you try to adapt to the world.
Mm.
And then there's a moment where that reverse and you say, no, 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 no. I want to be happy here. So I have to make the life that I want. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that happens usually around the midlife crisis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where, and I also feel that is exactly what happened to me. And the way it expressed itself was, I feel, no, the world is not going the right direction in terms of climate, ecology, resources. You know, we are destroying the ecological conditions of human survival. Life in corporations is becoming very toxic, very short term, very, you know, greed driven, and around fake accounting systems and then, you know, 95 was also the time of the Zapatistas and the first networked movements, you know, the assembly movement. And also all of that basically prepared the way for me to say, I have to get back to my engagement.
Okay.
But what do I do? That was the question, because I had been a Marxist, but I had rejected it. Emotionally, mostly. I didn't really go through like a whole critical evaluation. I said, should I reread Marx? And then I discovered the book Empire from Tony Negri and Michael Hart. And I don't know, there was an epic scope to that book. And he had integrated all the postmodern authors, you know, Foucault and Deleuze. And so I felt, okay, he's done the work for me. And so that book set me on a path of inquiry. And I took a 2-year sabbatical.
Okay.
So I studied themes like cognitive capitalism, network theories, but also crucially transitions. So I really took 2 years to read up on, well, how did the Roman Empire really end? How did we switch from a feudal system to the capitalist system?
Right.
And I came up with a theory, which is kind of a, I would call it seed form theory, which is the idea that social and political revolutions are only at the end of the process. And they explode because the system could not adapt in any other way to the new demands. But it can take many forms, you know, and if you just take that period of the establishment of a capitalist society, you have the Prussians, where it's the military class that takes power. It's a Tsar in Russia who liberates the serfs. It's a religious civil war in England. So the French and the Russian Revolution are not the norm. They're actually quite outlier processes. And so when you start looking at seed forms, what you see is the following. So at some point, the existing structure of a society, the existing institution no longer function.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Their answers just don't fit what is needed. And so
I get a sense of that.
Right. And so they start disintegrating, they lose legitimacy. And what you then have is at the beginning is an exodus. So the people who either are, you know, spiritual rebels, like they just don't accept the mainstream way of seeing the world, or people are forced to leave, you know, like the farmers who were chased away in Scotland during the enclosures. You know, their land was taken away. So this is a process of exodus, and these people who no longer fit or don't want to fit in the old system are looking for new solutions. And so they will invent patterns, solutional patterns, that are by definition different from the system that's no longer working.
Sure. Right.
Of
course.
And so they're introducing the new. And first the patterns are separate, and then so the patterns find each other. Eventually establish subsystems within the mainstream system. And then only eventually after a certain time, there is the qualitative jump.
Right.
where the new system becomes a new meta system, right? So let me give you a few examples. If you look at the shift towards, bourgeois capitalist society, you have
Okay.
an ideological change, which is purgatory.
Mm.
And there's a book about it from Jacques Le Goff, a French historian, where so the problem was after the 10th century, 11th century, there was actually a social revolution in Europe. And there's a very good book about it. It's called The First European Revolution, 975, 1050. And it's a revolt in France that starts in France with the monks of Cluny become very strong. Like 70% of the land is developed by monks at that time, right?
Okay.
And with the people, so what happened in Europe was you have the end of Roman Empire, 5th century, but the Roman institutions still perform until the 8th. That's when the Muslims destroy the control of the Mediterranean. And that's when commerce collapses, the roads can no longer be maintained, the cities empty out. And the attempts by the Germanic kings to unify fail, like Charlemagne. So in the 10th century, you get like a peer-to-peer feudalism. All the barons, the local barons build their castle, fight each other, rape the woman, steal the gold from the churches.
Peer-to-peer feudalism. I love that.
Yeah.
Nasty. That sounds nasty, but it is a funny name.
And that creates a massive social movement, which is called the Peace of God movement, in which the people in procession, with the Holy Mary, from start confronting the feudals with their sins. And it ends with a new social compromise, which is 1, make love, not war.
Okay.
So the feudal class promises to marry each other rather than to fight all the time.
Okay.
Primogeniture becomes general, and primogeniture means the oldest son gets everything.
Right.
And why is this interesting? But it creates peace in the family. Right. The first creates peace between families, and the second creates peace within the family. You don't have to fight for it. You get it. Yeah. And then the other sons, they can then they can go to the church. Or they can engage in conquests, like the Crusades. Right? So it creates a surplus in the elite.
Yep. Okay.
And then the farmers, they get some advantages. So it's the beginning of the parishes and the organization of social life and stability and all of that. But at the same time, the first enclosures. So we're slowly coming to my theme of predilection, which is the role of the commons. But they lose the right to hunt.
Okay.
And this forces the farmers to become more productive. So there's a productivity revolution. And so suddenly the cities come back. And the cities need money. But the Christians are not allowed to lend money. So that, the special role of the Jewish people. But purgatory, by creating non-mortal sins that can be bought back through indulgences. Right. Creates a money system, creates an accounting systems, creates a new vision of the world, and allows a new Christian class.
It's fascinating.
And it's the birth of the bourgeois merchant guilds in the new cities, right? And so that's the beginning of 4 centuries of development of the merchant class in a distributed system with weak imperial power. Okay. That eventually takes power after 4 centuries, and then we get the Renaissance and Reformation.
Right. This is all the
eventually the nation state in 1648, I think, with the Westphalian, the Treaty of Westphalia, right? So, but you look at these seed forms like purgatory, double entry accounting, the printing press, how they create a subsystem in the cities, and that eventually creates a new class that will take power and create a world at their image. And so my big thematic is that this is what is happening now. Okay. You have the capitalist system is in crisis because it overuses the the planetary boundaries. It violates the planetary boundaries. It creates also a social crisis because it's it creates more and more inequality.
So much equality. Yep.
And concentration at the top. And so again, we have the same phenomenon, exodus.
Yep.
Right. So for example, one of the things that I studied was the precariat. Right. So the feudality is born because the people have to flee the cities to survive at the end of the Roman Empire.
Okay.
So that's an exodus, right?
Yep, sure.
And then they find a place with the warlords that protect them, and that becomes feudalism, or they go in the monasteries or around the monasteries, right? So so the exodus creates these new forms that become the basis of the new society. And then in bourgeois society, what you have is the farmers are chased away through the enclosures, the privatization of the common land. They end up as workers in the cities. So again, you have an exodus and a class different, and a new class dynamic, right? And here what is happening today is that the salariat is imploding slowly. And these people becoming precariat, working on projects, no longer have a fixed salary, and they can only survive by exiting to the networks, right? So it's a bit different in the sense that people are not fleeing physically, but they're fleeing to a new social system. And in these networks, they engage in peer-to-peer relationships because anybody can associate with anybody else, and they create like virtual communities, virtual territories. They create all kinds of common projects and commons, like they create common knowledge pools that they use, and the Wikipedia and free software. And so my thesis is that this is the essential process of reconfiguration to a post-capitalist society that is common-centric. Now, let me give you, I'll return to they give you another theory that I have, which I call the pulsation of the commons.
The what?
Right? The pulsation.
Pulsation.
So the polarity play.
Yeah. Okay.
So what you have in human history is that once you have class societies, like 5000 BC more or less, right?
Okay.
And the Mesopotamian cities and the first Chinese kingdoms and stuff. So you have this social stratification around states and markets, right? And unlike libertarians, I believe the state is primary because the state creates the safety for the market. Can't have markets when everybody's fighting everybody.
Yeah, sure.
And the state market, in whatever form it takes, is essentially an extractive mechanism. Not accidentally, essentially.
Right.
And so what the market state system does is grow. So in other words, it's not even capitalism, right? It's further, it's more fun than that. Even feudal, tributary, imperial systems also engage in that. But of course they did it with limited technical means and limited geography.
Okay.
So what you can recognize, and this is documented by a book called Secular Cycles from Peter Turchin, for example, is you see how every societal system overreaches its regional planetary boundaries. And that creates a counter reaction, which is a spiritual popular reform that reintroduces the commons as a human institution. So the market and the state exhaust, but the commons as a human institution is designed to protect resources over the long term.
Interesting.
Right? And so there's an economist, Elinor Ostrom, who got a Nobel Prize in 2009 because she studied the commons over time.
I know her.
And fisheries and forest commons, and basically throughout history, until capitalism, people had commons. And that commons counteracted the extractive tendencies of the extractive superstructures. And when that balance was broken, then eventually there would be spiritual reform movements who would reestablish the balance and heal the society. Right. So I see this polarity play, the cyclic polarity play.
Yep.
And then you add in the progress of knowledge and technology, which gives a sense of direction.
Yep.
And you get a spiral development in which the commons always exist but are subsumed to the extractive systems.
Right.
Occasionally become center stage in these dark ages, the healing periods.
Okay.
And then become victim of their own success because they create then a surplus that creates a new condition for a new extractive period. And this is very well documented in this book, Secular Cycles. It's about a 300-year cycle in agricultural society on average.
Okay.
And what is the problem today is that we have reached the limit of that pulsation.
Okay.
Because under globalized capitalism, we have overreached everything. Right. And if you look at the history of capitalism from the 1600 onwards, it's always a play of finding new frontiers.
Right.
So all the societies couldn't do that. They would just collapse because no more frontiers. They couldn't, they couldn't reach out. So they would collapse and it would start over. But under capitalism, what you can do is, well, okay, the Polish countryside is depleted, so let's go to Ukraine.
Right.
And then let's go to the West, to the Western United States frontier, and then let's go to Africa, and let's go. And until a moment, of course, where you've done it everywhere, and you reach peak resources, and you reach carbonization issues, and so that's where we're at. And so this is then to finish that arc. So the idea is that because we are in planetary overreach, we now need shift towards a common centric societal organization, right? In which the market and the state have to be reformed and transformed so that they can serve a new central institution, which is no longer capital in the market, but actually the commons. And that this has to be taken place at a cosmolocal level. And so cosmolocal means basically that everything that is light should be ideally global and shared. So knowledge, technology, science, and everything that's heavy should ideally be relocalized. And I talk about the subsidiarity of material production.
Nice. Okay. So
imagine a world that consists of distributed factories.
Can I just pause you for just a sec?
And I need to drink something. So
yes, please.
Just a moment.
There's actually way back. I did. Maybe we'll circle back, and I'd be curious as to what you got in a fight with Ken Wilber about. So I had some curiosity there. The cosmo-local framing that you just afforded, and just the simplicity of that, everything light versus everything heavy, just tickled me a little bit. So I just wanted to double click on that and be like,
all right,
yeah, of course. Everything that can flow through the informational structures, right? And afford that. That's one division. I had heard the concept of rooted cosmopolitan, which is more on an identity structure. That has a little bit of cosmo-local flavor to it. And I'd heard cosmo-local, but I actually heard that. I was like, I wonder what that is. And then the way you just framed that was just brilliant. And so it tickled me. So I need to just say that, hey, that's cool. So anyway, I just wanted to say that.
So imagine this. You have, a global network of distributed production sites. Think about maker spaces, co-working spaces, but I think they will be specialized. I don't think you have this one universal technology. I think they'll be specialized. But today, you can make cars anywhere. You can, and so there's already a company doing that. Unfortunately, it's a proprietary IP. But there's a company called Arrival, and they they can make vans and buses anywhere in the world,
Wow.
you know. And in the US, you have local motors, you have open motors. So you have a global IP, which I think should be public. That's,
Mhm,
debatable, but that's
mhm.
what I believe.
Mhm.
And then you have a local instantiation,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
And you can have like biodegradable,
Mm.
materials. And so
Mhm,
the car is made so that it's modular.
mhm,
You can
mhm,
replace any part of it anytime
mm,
by building it locally.
mm,
It's only
mm,
produced when it's needed,
mm, mhm,
right? So there's no overproduction.
mm,
And merely the fact of not having global transportation already saves us 2/3 of the human footprint.
mm,
So we
mhm,
spend, I think it's 3 times as much on transporting things now than on producing them. So if
mm.
if you take a thermodynamic matter
Right.
energy
Yep.
accounting
Mhm,
of, so we use actually 3/4
hmm.
of matter energy,
So
not in
moving.
making things, but actually move them around.
Well, that's interesting.
And then what commoning also means is mutualization, right? So I think it's John Monbiot who talks about, what's his formula? It's a really good one. He says private sufficiency and public luxury.
Hmm. Okay.
Okay,
Mhm, mhm,
so let's take cars. Okay, so you could have public transport,
mhm,
and that's very good. But the problem with public transport is not point to point, so you
mm,
lose
mhm,
functionality. But
mhm.
you could have, like you have in Ghent, Belgium, co-ops like Degage and Partago, two names that I remember from there.
Okay.
And you could have in a neighborhood, and let's say you have 100 cars, and we know
Mhm,
that cars are only used
mm.
5% of the time on average.
Right.
So instead of 5%, you take 10%. So you have a double buffer,
Mhm,
and you say, let's have 10 cars
mm.
for these 100 families,
Right.
and we can guarantee there is always a car available,
Hmm.
always. And you have an electronic system. You can reserve the car when you need it,
Totally.
and that means you have all the freedom of travel,
Hmm.
but you only need 10% of the cars that you're using. So
Right.
that's a 90% drop
Mm. Nice.
in cost, in
Mhm.
thermodynamic cost, but
Right.
then also in financial cost,
Mm.
right? So it's also
Yep.
very social. It's
Mhm.
socially inclusive,
Hmm.
and it's run by the neighborhood itself. So it's
Mm.
also a democratic
Hmm.
institution, right?
Mm.
So there is a movement in the world now. It's called factor 20 reduction, and they claim, and they've done calculations, experiments, for example, with commercial transport,
Mhm.
that you can have the same amount of transport, would you wish so,
Yep.
and only use 5% of the energy by a combination of cargo bikes and electric vans.
Hmm.
And imagine they can be also made locally. So basically what I'm thinking about is that we're heading straight into the wall,
Mm.
and we have a very likely choice of going in a full dark age.
Mm.
But that means billions of people die,
Mhm.
and the cities get emptied out again, and
Mm.
you know or you can say, why don't we try to do this in a smoother way this time, because of our technical knowledge,
I'll vote for that.
right? And start really systematically transforming our productive
Mm.
tissue in this cosmolocal way,
Right. Hmm.
right? And then we can preserve a lot more of all the achievements of modernity, the
Mhm.
longer lifespan,
Mhm.
the public health, the
Mm.
the democratization of culture,
Right.
um,
Hmm.
and use so much less of
Yep.
the thermodynamic,
Mhm.
because there's another, what's his name, Peter Pogani, and he's very clear. He says our world, we get energy from the cosmos. We don't get matter,
Mm. Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And that means that matter is subject to decay. Like by reusing matter, it decays over time. The quality
Mhm.
of the matter decays.
Mhm.
So we cannot escape that the world is actually finite. So yeah, energy, yes, get solar, but in terms of like, raw materials, no, it's not infinite. And so we have to achieve a balance at the world scale.
Mhm.
And then I talk and propose things like global magisteria of the commons,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So what is happening today with the networks is the following. So we have a
We
geographic
had
organization
just
of the world.
FYI, we had
Yes.
Robert Ryan on
Yeah,
like
I
3
work with
weeks
him on this.
ago, and yep, I know. And
Yeah,
so
I
we
work
just
with
talked
him on
about
this.
magistrate and that kind of thing. So just FYI, there's
Right,
some of that backdrop there.
right. So same idea.
Mhm.
So what you have today is you have local geographic organization of the world.
Mhm.
You have transnational capital
Mm.
and an international state system.
Mhm.
But humanity is now moving to a virtual forms of organization,
Mm.
right? So
Mhm.
now we have a dual system, and kind of in my strategic thinking, what I'm saying is, what we need to build politically is a translocal, transnational civic force
Hmm. Okay.
that is common centric and can balance
Mm.
the power of the international state system and the transnational capital system.
Mm.
So those two extractive agents
Mhm. Mhm.
have to be compensated
Hmm.
by a translocal, transnational civic movement,
Interesting.
right? And the role of the nation state changes from trying to attract financial capital,
Mhm.
which is the game and the neoliberalism, right? That there's
Mhm.
Ulrich Beck, a German sociologist, talking about the risk society, said there's only one thing worse than being exploited by multinationals,
Hmm.
and that is not being exploited by multinationals.
Hmm.
And it's true.
Yeah.
Like
Mm.
there's, then you stay poor, nothing comes in,
Right. Right.
um, and so in this new configuration, the role of a nation state, which I don't think will disappear.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's where I'm not entirely on board with cosmopolitan
Mm.
ideas,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
I do believe that the nation is a historically rooted community form,
Mhm. Yep. Mhm.
and that we don't have anything to replace it yet.
Mm.
Maybe one day, but not today.
Yeah. No, definitely.
But
Mhm.
it can shift towards this idea of a partner state,
Mm.
and a partner state form is a state that supports social and personal autonomy
Mhm.
by creating the conditions for local commons to
Mm.
emerge and to attract the global knowledge flows,
Hmm.
right?
Mhm.
So what you get is a regional form of development where your job is to connect with global flows
Mm.
and
Hmm.
converge the interests of your locality with the virtual expertise that exists
Right.
in the
Right.
whole world,
Gotcha.
right?
Yep. Hmm.
Um, and okay, let me give you an example you know, of Japan. So
Okay.
there's a very good book about this. It's Mark Whitaker, and it's called Ecological Revolutions and the Axial Religions. And
Hmm.
he, documents what I was saying in the beginning about this pulsation
Okay.
mechanism.
Mhm.
So in 16th century Japan,
Mm.
you have a 100-year civil war,
Hmm. Okay.
and it's won by the shogun,
Mhm.
and that will set in what is called the shogunate, that will last until like 1863, the Meiji
Hmm.
Restoration.
Hmm.
So in this period, so after the shogun wins, the warlord competition, he disarms the people
Mm.
and he takes over the commons of the Pure Land Buddhist church. So
Okay.
one third of I might be wrong about the
Mhm.
figures, but
That's
anyway,
fine.
so let's say
Mhm.
1/3 of the land was controlled not by the state, but by local communities, local religious communities who had
Mhm.
their commons,
Mhm.
and the rules, like with Ostrom, it all fits the picture.
Mm.
And he takes over that land. destroys the church, but makes it into an imperial land and actually protects the land. So what you have in Japan is this social structure where you have the samurai on top, the farmers under, because they create the wealth, the crafts under the farmers because they transform the things, and the commerce at the bottom because they only trade it. You know, and he forces the samurai families to come to the court every 2 years where they impoverish themselves and keep busy. So it's the same strategy as in Versailles, you know, where Louis XIV pacifies the warlords who had revolted against him by creating Versailles and keeping them busy with politeness and the court civilization. And you know why this is interesting? Because it shows that you can change ruling classes. Right? It shows that you have a military class and it's completely pacified.
Fascinating.
So in Japan, it happened through Zen Buddhism, which pacifies the samurai because they had nothing to fight anymore. And so they interiorized their spirituality and became, you know, like an administrative class. And then in France, the same thing happened with the feudals, became the administration of the state. And so why is this important? Because I don't have the answer yet, but one of the things I'm thinking about is, you know, how can we transform capitalism
Totally.
with, you know, a class of people who are only thinking about profit and growing,
right?
And is there a way to give them a new role?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's I think is something to think about.
I agree.
And then the idea of the magisterial commons is that we have a global commons gap. So we have transnational capital, we have international state, but we don't have institutions that can protect planetary resources at scale, right? So let me give you an example of this, because I think this is probably the way it might go. So there is now a series of initiatives that work around the notion of global thresholds and allocations. Okay, so imagine you have, you know, the Mendeleev system of resources, and it actually exists online through the American Chemical Association. So you have copper, you have this, you have that. And you have a global institution which keeps track of the availability of matter and energy. How much is there of this? And then especially the negative pivots. So if we use more than this of copper, then we are entering a negative spiral. We cannot go in that negative spiral, so that we cannot go under that. And that means every year, you know, given the growth of productivity, given the new finds, that's how much copper there is in the whole world. And then we have to negotiate who gets what. And of course, that's the most difficult part. But if we can come to an agreement, then we have an international institution that can protect, you know, that distribution agreement, right? And here's what I think will happen is, first the nations will compete, and, you know, maybe we'll have huge issues around America and China competing for these dwindling resources. But if we don't want World War III, then, and maybe let's try it first, right? Because that's human nature. But at some point, I think after a series of pedagogical catastrophes, then there will be this condition where people say, well, we better create those institutions or we all go out, we all go down, right? And then that becomes really attractive, that, okay, we should do this because otherwise the alternative will be universal war. So this is what I think will happen, is that, you know, our system gets into systemic crisis, things go bad, people die, conflicts emerge, and then, like, how do we get out of this? And then, oh, the commons is actually the only human institution that has proven over history that it can maintain resources over the long term and create social peace. And Peter Pagani says, that we've moved, through different global systems. So he says global system 0 was the mercantile system
Okay.
before Napoleon,
Hmm.
right?
Mm.
And then you have the Napoleonic Wars, which are so costly for Europe
Mm.
that they decide to have a 100-year peace,
Hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So that ushers in the Smithian capitalist system,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but it's very costly for the working class,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
The free trade
Right,
is
right. Mm-hmm.
like workers die when they're like 33 in the 1850s in the UK.
Mm.
It's a complete disaster.
Mm.
But then eventually it gets better, but then you have World War One, and that's the collapse of the that global system. And then we get into Fordism, which is an agreement between capital and labor, which becomes dominant after World War II, becomes the system, but is at the cost of nature and the global south.
Yep.
Right? And he calls it weak multilateralism. So Smithian capitalism had no multilateralism. And the global system after World War II has weak multilateralism, the United Nations. And he says now we need to move towards strong multilateralism and a social contract for labor in the whole world, rather than just in the West, and between humans and nature.
Right.
Right? And that's where the magisteria fit in. The magisteria is the means of doing that.
Right.
Of making global agreements. And let me say a word about the blockchain, because that's also important. So, I know there's a lot of critique about the blockchain and the Bitcoin, and most of it is entirely on track. But what it also does is it has created the idea and the technical capability to have global public accounting. So we move from an internet of communication where we can talk to each other, organize, to an internet of transactions, right? And so I published a report where because this is most of what I do is trend analysis, looking at weak signals and seeing where these seed forms can go, right? So I imagine a system which already exists in its components where you have a layer of contributive accounting.
Okay.
Because what is the problem with capitalism is externalities. It's not counting a lot of positive contributions, like women's work is not counting. All the people work for free on free software. All the people who maintain society through their volunteering, that's all not counted, doesn't exist. And then negative contributions, negative impact is also not counted. That's not my problem, because I have an accounting system which only tells me what's coming in and out of my little system, and whether I keep a surplus, and then I'm happy, right? But there's no ecosystemic view within double entry book accounting. So contributive accounting is an agreement within a productive community, a cosmolocal productive community, a peer production community that says, okay, we know that value is created through contribution, not just commodity work, right? So take Linux, you have 75% of people are paid and 25% are not paid. But we know that our success depends also on those 25% non-paid.
Right, sure.
So we're going to create a membrane around our system, create intelligent money tokens, and we'll design a system so that a part of what's coming in from the commodity system is redistributed to the contribution. So we shift from a commodity regime to a contributory regime. So I think this is the big thing that will happen.
Okay.
So it's the positive and negative contributions become the key for the new account. So that already exists, and I give a lot of examples in my report. The second is a shift towards flow accounting. So there's something called resources, events, agents.
Okay.
And this is a 3D accounting system that for every transaction tells you your place in the network.
Hmm.
There's no more double entry.
Hmm.
It's an ecosystemic flow,
Okay. Mhm.
right? And you know exactly where you are in the ecosystem.
Hmm.
So suddenly your vision of managing, you know, becomes a global ecosystemic vision.
Mhm.
And then the third one is direct thermodynamic accounting, which is integrating. So you have a magisterium of the commons that
Okay.
manages the flow of matter and energy.
Mhm.
There's a social agreement that every country, every region can use so much.
Hmm.
And then you actually see it in your accounting system.
Hmm.
All these things exist,
Hmm. Hmm.
but we need a vision. That's what I'm trying to provide. We need a
Right.
vision where these pieces of the puzzle can become part of a new vision of,
Mhm.
you know, sustainable world system. And that's what I'm
Now
trying
is
to
it,
do.
in terms of the cultivation of the peer-to-peer foundation, is that the architecture for that, or how? Tell me a little bit more about that vision and how the P2P foundation, you know, is connected to that, overlaps, is synonymous, etc.
Yeah. So, okay, we had a very good run, and we're a bit of a crisis, and I need to explain that as well.
Okay.
And that bring us around the notion of the woke
Yep.
ideology.
I'm hanging out in Bard's listserv because I know a little bit about that in my own history. Okay.
Right. Well, so the thing is, I consider the woke ideology a civilizational autoimmune syndrome.
Okay.
And okay, so I think woke represents a gnostic movement, a utopian gnostic movement, which has the same dangers as the ones we had before, like Stalinism and Nazism, right? So there's a shift in vision. So in the industrial system, we had two competing visions. We had the liberal vision and the socialist vision. The liberal vision is, let's have equal laws for everybody, and then everybody makes an effort, and the, you know, those with merit can move up. The problem with this vision is, of course, that not everybody had the means to do this.
Right. Totally.
So the answer to this was the socialist vision, which is, let's create an infrastructure of access to these means so that the legal equality becomes real equality, right? And that has been the historical role of social democracy, is to create all these public infrastructure, which gave the working class an effective way to get education, to get public health, to get all the things they couldn't have in the, you know, free market system. And in a way, we had a kind of liberal socialist system, right, which had elements of both, you know, mixed economy thing.
Yep.
That in the West worked, you know, to a serious degree, and anyway. But woke is no longer that. Woke is saying, no, we need equal outcome, right? So they have a vision of a system without differentiation, where everybody is equal, and where every power differential is evil. And so this is a typical pure vision, yeah, absolute pure vision of what the world should be. But then the next step they make, and and that's a paradox and a contradiction, is saying, well, to get there, the people on top have to go to the bottom, and the people on the bottom have to go on top. Right? And this is basically what Stalin did and what Mao did in terms of class. But what they're doing is, then they then biologize and essentialize it by saying, you know, white exploit non-white people, males exploit females, so they make an absolute counter hierarchy. And in order to achieve that, they have to basically undermine every system that makes the world efficient, right? So if these people cannot get in the system, then, well, that's because the exams are have racist outcomes, so let's have no exams, or let's have weaken the exams, right? And because of their Puritan vision, they you know, the notion of fragility that they've introduced is that's where the poison is, because the ideological, basic ideological idea, and you know, by the way, that was the same that the Puritans had during the Reformation, and radical Marxists would have, is that if you don't agree with us, it's because you're evil, right? So your disagreement is not a disagreement. It's because you're evil, and we cannot allow you to speak because you're harming us, right? And so this introduces a totalitarian practice, right? And so I got in the middle of that. I'm an old style lefty, you know, egalitarian.
Yep.
But within that frame that I explained to you, which is we have to create society where, you know, we create the means so that the poor and the workers can achieve this real equality within a system that still recognizes individual initiative and lets people do their thing. And there's a lot I want to change. You know, I want to actually change the three key institutions. But I don't want to abolish anything. I don't want to say no market or no state. What I'm saying is we need a simultaneous transformation towards the common centric logic, right? Anyway, so I got into trouble in August 2018. Where I posted 2 critical videos of Jordan Peterson.
Oh, really? It was of Jordan Peterson. That's how I got in trouble too,
yes.
by the way.
All right. And you know, the way I had framed it was very, you know, I thought normal.
Yep.
Which I said, well, you know, this is a really interesting guy. But why is it? And I'm talking to a mostly liberal and progressive audience that follows me, and I'm saying, why is it that people in trouble have to go to him? And why is there no answer on the left to this kind of suffering, you know, that people have, right? And so my analysis was, I think the left is too politicized. It only sees politics, right? And so why are we not talking about the meaning of life and you know, all these things? And instead of having a debate, there was an explosion of hate. He's a fascist, he's a Nazi. Stop talking about him. And by the way, you're male. And you know, you can't talk about this, and you're white, you can't talk about this. And I revolted. And to be honest, I had systematically underestimated the power of woke. I thought it was a marginal thing in the university. And then suddenly I discovered that, you know, a sizable amount of my own audience has shifted. You know, there was like a German Marxist that I was talking to at the time, and he, you know, he said me like, oh, but you know, white people don't really need voting rights. So what? You know, so I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And so I reacted fairly radically and defended. And then these people basically banded together. You know, I received ultimatums like, stop doing this, or, and then I didn't stop. And then they started campaigning. So I became canceled. I lost 2/3 of my invitations. And then I decided to study it. So, you know, I read like 7, 8 books about woke. I follow YouTube channels. And I think it's really a central element of that we're facing. And it deeply affects the commons movement as well. And so the P2P Foundation itself got really in difficulty around this, because what I'm feeling is that most of my progressive friends are gradually falling into that position, right? And I completely reject that. I'm that's where probably, you know, radical myself, I say, no, this is racist. You cannot hierarchize people around these, you know, biological characteristics. you cannot discriminate against people, like they do in Vermont, and say, oh, the vaccines are only for people of color, or in Oakland, only white homeless people cannot get any support from the city, and Biden, who said COVID support is not for white businesses. This is something that I just totally reject. This is not the kind of society I want to move into. Now, in a way, the commons itself is immune to that to a certain degree, because in a contributory system, I cannot give you anything just because you are from a certain group, right? So anyway, I talk about woke capitalism. So I think there is a new class alliance. And so let me explain. Is that interesting to you? Those
Sure.
kinds of analysis?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, one thing that I would like to, kind of after this is sort of laid out, share a little bit about this UTOK system that I built, and then think about that in relationship to the commons and what might be an interface there. But yes, please, the woke capitalism sounds very interesting.
So 19th century, we have this big labor issue, poverty, class, and the socialist movement kind of brings that in society, and it ends with a compromise, which is the social democratic system and the New Deal, which is a deal between capital and the leaders of the labor movement.
Right.
Okay. And that system gets hit by 1968, 1973, and 1989. So there is a shift of an alliance between capital and labor to an alliance between capital and the leaders of the new cultural movement, which are identity movements. But I think they're positive identity movements. But basically, 1968 is a labor revolt and a student revolt.
Okay.
And the Western ruling class says, okay, we can't answer the workers' demands. We can't afford it. So we're going to globalize and deindustrialize the West. But we're going to compromise on cultural issues with our sons and daughters, who are the students.
Okay.
Right. And that creates this shift towards a consumer society in 1968, and towards women's rights and gay rights. And for me, this works until 2008. So Obama, I think, is typical in, there's a big financial crisis, but instead of helping the vast majority of the people, he saves the financial system instead. And suddenly, the professional classes, the minorities, they see their prospects, like they lose their homes. And so I think that's where you have this move towards radicalization, towards a shift in identity politics from inclusive identity politics, which I was on board with. Like,
sure,
why there are only whites here, and there's 20% blacks, and we should do something about it. And we had diversity politics, and it morphed into this racist, scapegoating, exclusive identity politics, where if we want to win, you have to lose. Right. And so paradoxically, it becomes a war machine against the white working class, but also poor blacks. Like defunding the police is like entirely
totally
a catastrophe. There's 6,000 extra deaths in the poor neighborhoods. And so I think the alliance now is the 1% with the 20%. So you have Occupy, which is a reaction to 2008.
Right.
And it's the 99% against the 1%. And suddenly you see at the end of Occupy, you see the first identity groups that are challenging Occupy. And accusing it of being racist and white and stuff. And so Occupy starts imploding. And this is unbelievable, and it's needs to be researched. But suddenly all the mass media start talking about identity issues. It's a hockey stick. Every term that we know today
explored that.
starts in 2012 starts just going exponential. And so I don't think that's accidental. I think in terms of class domination, it's let's ally with the leaders of minorities, right? So you have the cognitive class, the cognitive urban class, aligning for new dispensation around group allocation, but at the cost of the 70% at the bottom. And what they are doing is they're moving to the right. So we have a left, which is becoming the party of the urban cognitariat, and a right wing, which is an alliance between local business and local workers, like the somewheres versus the nowheres, right? And so this is the mess we're in right now. This is the, like, and this is very much like the end of the Roman Empire, where the Christians undermined all the connective tissue of the pagan world. And so 10 years after the Christian reforms, which was unfunding the public cults, 10 years later, the Germans invaded Rome.
Interesting.
And I think this is what is happening. It's autoimmune disorder, and it complicates everything. And I don't have a complete answer to how we deal with this. But what I'm trying to do is through the commons is create relationships between. So I want to give you an example, and then we can move to the other topic.
Sure.
So
no, this is important.
We want 100% organic food for public school students in Ghent. This is a real example. Copenhagen already did it. So you make an agreement between the local farmers, in the bioregional organic farmers. You have a cargo bike system of transport, zero carbon. You rehire the cooks in the schools, and you have the geeks in charge of the IT system. So suddenly you create an ecosystem that reconnects the urban working class, the farmers, and the cognitive elite in one common ecosystem. So this is what I'm advocating. I'm advocating for local and regional policies that recenter development around reindustrialization, distributed reindustrialization, and reconnecting the productive tissue by creating, trans-class communities where people work together in complementary fashion. Because otherwise we're going to have this civil war between the Trumpians and the Clintonians, which is, let's do empire at the cost of the nation versus let's give up empire for the nation. And those two forces, but none of them have really an answer, I think, to the crisis we're facing.
Totally.
Just a moment.
Of course.
Okay. I have 15 minutes left.
No, that's about, we've been going for,
okay.
We'll be getting to wrap up here. So that's fine. So anyway, let me just give you a little bit of and then you can just riff off of.
And I'm going to have a drink while you talk.
Please. Yeah. So, I'm getting certainly the sense that we're, not, and I'm obviously not alone in this, but all sorts of transformations are happening. The digital virtual world's an unbelievable shift in obviously the informational structure. I paid a lot of attention to information systems and communication. The medium of the artificial intelligence and the internet really is like a global sensorium, and that's going to transform all sorts of opportunities and create all sorts of flux and chaos. All of the social, systemic, economic, market forces stuff that you described resonates with me, and you obviously know an enormous amount about it in relationship to where I come from. So my expertise is really in theoretical psychology and in sort of also psychotherapy at the level of sort of individual small group relationship. And then what I stumbled across inside the academic knowledge structures was a fundamental inadequacy and misalignment between our scientific, philosophical, and humanistic structures, okay?
Right.
And so there's a thing called the problem of psychology, which is the intellectual inability of us. We tried to create a science of a thing called behavior and mental process. And it turns out that there were complete inadequacies in the ability to do that. More popularly, this is known as the mind-body problem. But I come at it through the institutional architecture of what psychology became as it struggled to build a system, and then realized it would fail in relationship to it because there was just competing schools of thought that had slices of the problem, but nobody had a whole, and therefore the competing systems would just battle against each other. And then the field drops into this sort of this dead amalgamation of compromise. And then a method of the behavioral science methodology emerges, which is right underneath science, social science methodology. It's a behavioral science methodology. And then it's a collection of schools of thought and topics that all, at least the science of psychology, then is married to the method, okay? And I got sucked into that, and I got first through I was an empirical scientist, and then I wanted to become a therapist, and then I saw the problem, and then I asked, well, I need an scientific architecture as a therapist to then be informed about the work that I did. And then I realized, as people in the program know, then I backed into it's like, oh my God, nobody knows what the fuck psychology is. It's a shit show of confusion at the ontological level. Okay. And then my journey actually, although it's, I'm re-narrating it for efficiency and everything else and the way I help people frame it. But ultimately then what emerges is a unified theory of psychology that addresses the psychotherapy. And it becomes a unified theory of knowledge because I realized that actually the problem wasn't so much in psychology per se, but it was the entire metaphysical, philosophical architecture of understanding that emerges out of the Enlightenment, okay? And when we get a particular kind of empirical science that does a very good job at delineating matter and motion with Newtonian mechanics, and then sticks chemistry on it, and then eventually natural selection sticks biology on it, you get a natural science system that's enormously powerful, especially as it connects to technology, okay? And then affords the science tech feedback loop. It gets in then a worldview battle with the old Christian dual world system, okay? And you get the classic sort of theistic versus atheistic system, at least simplistically, okay? But the consequence in terms of the meaning structures basically is then the cognitive class, after it punts on theism, then gets itself into basically this weird physicalism, okay?
Yeah.
Or it doesn't really understand the metaphysics of human mental behavior and can't figure out, well, are you going to be scientific about it or not? And what is this? And then we basically get a chaotic, fragmented pluralism around our frame of our understanding. And so the unified theory then calls that the Enlightenment Gap, which is the failure to identify matter and mind in proper relation and understand scientific relative to social knowledge in proper relation, which is the modernity versus postmodern sort of epistemological problem. And then ultimately then what UTOK is a meta-modern sensibility that solves the problem of psychology and then affords us a new philosophy that both enables us a clear scientific psychology, but one that's congruent with our subjective folk experience of being in the world and affords a merger in that regard. And then at the level of cosmological structures, why I double checked on that, it's like, well, a distributed knowledge system that actually aligns the natural sciences, scientific psychology, subjective psychology, and then can ground a particular both philosophy and social ethic is something that I think is part of what would be an ingredient.
So I have to admit, I looked at your system, but not long enough to get all of it out.
It's a labyrinth.
I thought I can only tell you that my first reaction is yes, that's it. Like in terms of how you describe the emergent new forms of knowledge and stuff. So let me kind of explain what the way I think about psychology.
Sure.
So, and it's related to the woke and how the commons is actually an answer to this. So I feel that modernity started with Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am.
It's a good place to have it begin. I can go with that.
Right. So, and it's, its subjectivity comes into play as a real thing, an individuality. And now we ended up with the woke movement saying, I suffer, therefore I am. So it's a complete implosion of identity. And so the war that we have today is between people who are rooted, the people who don't move, and these are the somewheres, right? And they tend now to become conservative and go to the right, and they still feel connected to their nation, their religion, their community.
Yep.
And the cognitive class, which is completely unrooted, they are regressing to this thing, you know, I am skin and my gender, and there's nothing there. I mean, it's very frightening. I may be exaggerating, but that's really what I think. And I've seen interviews of people saying exactly, they completely identify themselves as, you know, being exploited and being dominated. And that's the worldview. Okay. So what does the commons bring to that? Is a contributory psychology. You know, I am what I make with others.
Nice. Yes.
So you have your own passion, and that's where it starts from. I have to find an activity in life, a meaningful engagement that corresponds to my passion and knowledge and skills.
Beautiful.
And then we have a social system, a virtualized productive system that allows me to see what the world needs and find a community where I can contribute to. And so I build my identity by combining my contributions. I am a vegan, Buddhist free software developer, right? So that's the start.
Yep.
And I win. I'm in a group, and we help each other, and we do something for the common good. So it aligns the, you know, a whole number of positive things. And we no longer have division of labor, but distribution of tasks. And so equipotentiality is the idea that every group judges people based on their contributions within a particular context. So I'm not saying I'm better than you or I'm worse than you. I'm just saying, wow, Gregg is a very good psychologist and is, you know, very useful in our endeavor to create a psychology knowledge commons, right?
Right.
I'm not saying that's the full answer, because I think there's something deeper that isn't solved by those contributory. And to be honest, in that part, I'm conservative. I think that you build subjectivity through your lineage. And therefore, I feel we have to engage with our past, with our civilization, with the debates we're having. We need to extend it to the other civilizations. So I think in certain way, we are moving toward post-civilizational world, because, you know, I don't know if you read Spengler, which is, you know, really great to read about how every civilization is different, right?
Yep.
And we have different world souls. I don't think that works nowadays, because, you know, I live in Asia, and Thailand is very different, but also Western, right? There's a sense in which even Asian Buddhists have completely accepted growth, consumption, a way of organizing production. And so I no longer believe we are really in these separated civilizations. I think we need to find ways, but it's probably going to be two layers. You know, a layer where I am Flemish, and that links me to, you know, the history of the Flanders and of Belgium and of Europe, and that's part of my identity. The other part of my identity is that I'm working around the commons, and I'm, you know, that's my productive identity.
Right.
And then I'm engaging with other people in the world, and so I have my feet in the mud, my heart in my community, and my brain is cosmic. That's the way I see it.
All right.
I don't know if that fits in your vision.
No, that totally fits. I mean, certainly the cultivating the basic institutional contingency and structures to afford individuals that investment and finding that contributional structure, also articulating the nature of, I'm somewhat conservative too in relationship to the construction of the subject, its embeddedness, the process by which we understand globalization, maintain localization. The identity of what's called the rooted cosmopolitan idea basically is the rooted
So
in your structure.
rootfulness, right? Rootfulness rather than rootlessness.
Yes, exactly. And to then figure out a way to create a weave that afford a wisdom commons that we plug into is a beautiful vision, and definitely the kind of, as I look across the landscape of possible transformations and ideas that would kind of cultivate a shift from the current momentum and inertia of what might transform us in that direction. This definitely sounds very much in the ballpark to me, which is why I want to talk to you. So.
Yeah. And sorry, I do have to go now.
No, it's been a great time to afford the opportunity to get your landscape view and all your contributions and insights. And I really appreciate it, and it means a lot. And I look forward to the future conversations.
I promise myself I will study your work as well. I think it's important. I have an intuition that this is exactly the synthesis that we need in that field. And my job is to convince people like you and others that you also need to think about the commons and integrate that in your work, right? And that's what I'm trying to do, is to introduce that particular viewpoint.
Yes.
We have a long way to go.
But together we can cultivate a wisdom commons. So there it is.
Exactly. Yeah, that was a great conversation. I thank you for inviting me and giving me the space and the time to explain what I'm doing.
I appreciate you coming along and sharing that. So I wish you the best of luck, and we'll be in touch as we build this thing.
All right, Greg, thank you. And thank you for your good cheer. And
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing your story. Really appreciate it. Thank you.